David Palmer. I'm the System Vice President of Financial Planning for Peace Health. And we are, or what I'm going to do is give you an overview of who we are. That's the next slide. And then how we set up the forecasting tool for us. And then the governance process that we're following. And then just a couple of examples of network and facility level financial statements, as well as the departmental performance report or dashboard that we're using along with this tool. So as far as who we are, we're located in Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. We have 10 hospitals. We have 169 medical group locations. So you can get an idea of our scope and size of our organization. So for rolling forecasting, what we started with was the RF groups. So with our 10 hospitals, what we did was we took all of the departments and we aggregated them down to 15 RF groups. And you can see them listed there in the table with admin, cardiology, emergency, nursing. So all of our nursing departments are all rolling up into nursing. And that includes rehab and psych units, as well as long-term care. And then we segregated out our home health just because we do have our medical group finance area that is responsible for managing the home health financials and forecasts. So we split that out as well. Otherwise, that would have likely been under ancillary, that RF group, but that's the reason why we split those out. So we just wanted to get a smaller subset of RF groups, enough to be manageable for each hospital, but still broken out at enough detail where the statistics used would correlate with the revenue and the expenses as well. So for the 10 hospitals, we have 15 RF groups. For the medical group, what we did there was we set up one RF group for each one of the communities that they serve. So we essentially have 10 RF groups for the medical group because we have 10 hospitals. So that's how those are aligned. For shared services or our corporate headquarters, what we did there was we set up an RF group for each one of our vice president level leaders. So that's why you're seeing so many. The idea is right now, the forecasting tool is really being managed by the finance teams and executive level of the organization. We haven't cascaded it down to department level just yet, but the idea for shared services is that we will cascade this down to that system vice president level coming up soon. And then we also set up elimination RF groups so that way we can consolidate our financial statements and eliminate out any transactions that need to be eliminated. So what I'll go over next is the RF codes. So for the RF codes, what we did was we started with the high-level summary income statement categories for the codes, and then we added codes for the areas that needed a little more detail for us to complete the forecast. So for the charges, we added the financial class levels as well, so that way it works with the deduction calculator. And we are using that deduction calculator for the 10 hospitals, and we use that percentage charge method to calculate that deduction. For the first quarter, because we didn't have the general ledger actuals aligned with those financial class accounts, we had to use 0 ZBA rates basically and load those in manually. But for the first quarter, this next quarter update that we just did here in September, we were able to use the historical values posted in the first quarter in the general ledger at the financial class level. So we didn't have to run new ZBA rates. We could use what was posted to the general ledger. So it made that calculator work extremely efficiently for us. And the results were reasonable. So we really didn't have to make very many adjustments other than layering on those rate increases that we're anticipating in the future. For salaries, we broke that out into management just because we consider those fixed. And then we have other physician mid-levels and then contract labor. And we broke out each one of those, except for contract labor, into productive, overtime, and non-productive. And for benefits, we split that into two pieces so that we had one calculating as a percent of salaries and the other on a per FTE basis. So FICA is percent of salaries and medical benefits is per FTE. That's kind of how we set that up. And then we have our allocations for elimination purposes also identified. Now I'll go over how we selected our key statistic for each one of our RF groups. So because we have several departments rolling up into each group, so this is an example of one of our hospitals here in the Northwest region for the ancillary RF group. You can see all of the statistics that are already being reported. So we didn't want to add in any new processes. So we wanted to use the existing statistics that were being reported at the department level. So what we did here was we used the correlation formula within Excel to try to identify which key statistic to use for inpatient revenue, outpatient hospital revenue, and other patient revenue, which is essentially our medical group revenue. So for this ancillary RF group, we identified that the CPT for inpatient procedure statistic that was being reported was the most correlated to those inpatient charges. So we used that. On the outpatient side, we used the CPT Ford. It had a result of 0.93, which is the highest, as you can see, compared to the other statistics. So it was highly correlated. So we used it. So that's how we identified the counts that were currently or previously being reported to use as the key statistic for each one of our RF groups. It was all based off of the charges because we felt that that would be the best way to approach that correlation formula or result, since expenses tend to swing a little more with little latency with flexing and things like that. So that's why we focused on charges to identify which statistic to use. For the expenses, what we did there was we looked at the variable and fixed percentage calculations that I'm about to show you to see if we could use the variable component as a way of forecasting. So for the fixed variable component on the expense side, what we used for this was the slope formula within Excel, as well as the intercept formula within Excel. And this next slide here shows you how that formula works. So I won't go over it, but this has the formulas that are in these results. So for this particular hospital in our Columbia network, you can see that the emergency department here has a slope result of 0.04, which what you do for the variable component is multiply that 0.04 by the statistic reported, and it tells you what the variable component of those expenses are. And then the intercept, what you do here is you multiply it by the number of months in the table that you're using. So for this particular example, it was 3 months, July through September. So you multiply that 507 times 3, you get your 1,500 fixed component. Add the two together, you get your total expenses. We compare it to what is actually being reported for that department and that particular RF code. We're only looking at productive all other. It should be 0. The actual results should equal your variable and fixed component. And then what we do is we compare the percentages to see whether we can use them or not. So the emergency department and imaging departments, we did use those variable and fixed percentages, but for the lab department, there really wasn't a correlation with the statistic used, because we have this 104 and -4%, so it wasn't used. So that's how we set up the fixed variable percentages on our expense side. And what we have is a report written in Axiom where we can go in and we can select the RF codes that we're interested in reviewing. So it's a drop down and it'll update the results for you. This next slide goes over the process that we are currently using to update the forecasts. So we update it on a quarterly basis on the quarter end, basically. So for September, when we closed the books in October, shortly thereafter, we started updating the forecast for October through December, and then for the remainder of our fiscal year through June. So we're going to be doing that for the remainder of the year. When we do the January update using December data, we'll also be forecasting out the next fiscal year. So that way it can inform us on the targets that we can set for that next fiscal year coming. And we'll update it again, refresh it in March, just to ensure that we're still on track. We have our stewardship committee. Our stewardship committee sets the targets for the next fiscal year in June, but what they also do is on a quarterly basis, they update those targets for us. So in June, they gave us a fairly low target for fiscal year 21 that we just started. And then in September, when they met, they more than doubled that target on us because we were outperforming the results. And we didn't see that there would be a trend to tell us otherwise. So they increased that target. So I'll get to the governance in a little bit, but that's the frequency of our updates and stewardship committee meetings. So the way that we update our forecast is we start with the statistics at the facility level. So essentially our discharges, patient days, outpatient visits, emergency visits, surgery case counts, things like that. And then what we do is we get buy-in from the network leadership that they agree with those statistic forecasts. And then what we do is we cascade it down to the RF groups to develop their key statistics. And then once we have those in place, we can update the actual plan files. And as we're updating the plan files with those new statistics, since we're already in the first month of that first quarter, we compare our month-to-date charges posted to what is being calculated by the RF plan file, just to ensure that it's still tracking closely. So that's how we ensure that our statistics are still good for the 1 month at least. And then we also compare our calculated expenses to trend, just to make sure that they look reasonable. And then we run summary financial statements or income statements just to provide an overview for each facility as well as network. And we provide those updates to the CFO of each network so that we can get their buy-in and approval. So when I keep saying we, the folks or the analysts or the team that are updating the forecast right now is at the system level. The network teams are not updating the forecast plan files. The intent is to shift that work to them though in the future. But for now, it's held at system. And then once the CFO feedback is received, we make those final adjustments, and then I share the results with our system CFO. So that's our update process. So I already alluded to how the stewardship committee is managing this process now. So what we provide to them are just summary financial results. And what they do is each quarter when they meet is they give us new targets for the next quarter and fiscal year remaining. And then that gets trickled down to our network leadership. So for our network leaders, what we do for them is we provide summary and detailed financial statements that compare against the forecast results. And we do that on a monthly basis. And I'll show you a sample of one of those reports in a little bit. And then for department leaders, what we're using is the Axiom Performance Dashboard, and we are comparing to the 3-month moving average as opposed to trying to cascade down a forecast or using some other method. So the 3-month moving average is what they're being compared to and held accountable to. So our financial statements are made up of two things. One is statistics and metrics, and then the other report is basically our financial results. And all of these statistics are at the forecast level as well. So we're able to do all of this here with actual to forecast comparisons for the current month and year to date. So one thing to keep in mind is with rolling forecasting, we did have to do a little bit of relearning how year-to-date variances will look in, say, October for us when we transition to a new quarter. Those historical forecast periods kind of go away and they get replaced with actual performance. So for our October financial statement for year-to-date, that forecast column is essentially our actual results for the first quarter plus the forecast for October. So that was a little bit of learning for our executive team, but they got there. They understood that our target had changed from being very low to reasonably set. So they realized that those favorable variances that we had year-to-date September weren't going to carry forward in those future periods. So it didn't make much sense to report that first quarter variance throughout the rest of the year. So just a heads up with your leaders, you might want to let them know about that. And then for the financial statement, these are the levels that we are currently reporting on for the income statement. And also the column. So you can see we have actual forecast, the variance to forecast and prior year displayed. And then this example here is a report that we use for our month-end close process. So since we're comparing to forecast and there's a lot more detail in the actuals, like here's an example of our revenue section where we have all of the financial classes and different types of revenue. I know I blurred this out, but the forecast is only at that inpatient revenue level. So we can't report at the level that the actuals are coming through at. So what we're doing is we're copying the forecast results and putting them into a custom table. So that way these types of financial statements will still allow for a drill down. Unfortunately, the forecast tables don't allow for drill down. So that's why we had to go this path of creating that custom table, copying out our forecast results and using it for these type of comparative reports that are detailed to allow our financial analysts at the network level and facility levels to be able to drill down at the sub-account level just to see what is happening. So what we're doing is we look at the variance for the forecast, but we also look at the variance to the 3-month trend at the account level. So what we're able to do is identify which account to drill down on based off of this 3-month trend, but we can compare the overall subtotal to see where we have an issue. So there are various levels of review that we do. We have the forecast column, we have the 3-month moving average column, and then we also have a monthly trend that rolls for 13 periods there so that you can see if there are peaks and valleys that are just seasonal and it's correct. So this is a close report that we use, and this is mainly for financial analyst purposes. Okay. So now I'll move over to the department performance dashboard. And I'm only going to go over the operational overview tab. I'm calling it a tab. I don't know what it's called. Maybe it's a view. But there is a summary view and an executive overview view that I won't go over. But these kind of roll up the results of various departments for you. So you can see a facility-wide view. We are using them, but for this, I thought I would focus on just the department overview. So with this little filter button here, you can click on it, and what it'll do is it'll give you an option of picking a department. So I selected the ICU here at one of our smaller facilities as a sample. And what we hope to do is move to managing our financials off of KPIs as opposed to variance amounts. So that is the goal. So for now, though, we are still managing department variances using a variance to the 3-month moving average as opposed to KPIs for now. We're holding until we get to a new normal and things stabilize. So the idea, though, is with comparative analytics that we're currently implementing, we'll be able to have benchmarks to compare against and set targets for our departments with that third-party benchmark, as well as just having that 3-month moving average to compare against to ensure that we're continuously improving over time. So the KPI section here just shows you your revenue, expense, and labor KPIs per units compared to the 3-month average, and these are the variances for the month of September that are being displayed. And then the next screen, which is patient revenue, shows you your performance on inpatient revenue and outpatient revenue. And depending on which one of these cards you select, so this one is selecting on inpatient, it shows you the inpatient revenue at that detailed account level, as well as the performance over time with the rate and volume variances identified by those bars and your statistic as the little green line. So if you were to click on outpatient revenue, everything would update to the outpatient revenue view. So this gives a department, just a department leader, an overview of how they're performing on their revenue side. And then for labor, what it does is it shows you the KPIs that were on that first tab there. It also shows you the detail on the accounts, as well as a trend over time. So you can see actual salaries current year versus last year, and the average hourly rate. And then for other expenses, this is another one where you can pick whether you want to see supplies or whether you want to see other expenses. This is currently only showing supplies, so you can see all your supply expenses. And then you can see the trend over time, actual to last year, as well as supplies per their key statistic. This is the most important part of it, though, is the variance comment collection tab. What we're using still here is the 3-month moving average for the month. And we do ask leaders to explain any variances that are greater than $5,000 and 5%. So that's plus or minus $5,000, favorable or unfavorable. And what we're doing is we're aggregating all of the salary accounts to just the subtotal row here. So you can see it's blurred out, but you can kind of see the little blue square there where they would enter in their comments. So we're asking them to explain their salaries at the subtotal level, as well as their supply variances at that subtotal level, as opposed to the account level. They still have the option to explain those account level variances, but this is the required entry for us. The one thing that I didn't show here was there is a button on the right-hand side that you can toggle between month and year to date. So you can flip this thing to year to date, and what it'll do is it'll compare against the same period last year. That's what we chose to do. The dashboard is nice, though, because it does calculate out the rate and volume variances for you, which is helpful for department leaders. So that way they can easily explain their variances if it's volume-based or rate-based. Yeah, we were still living old school where we were posting those financial statements to a shared folder, and then department leaders would go in, and depending on their access rights, they could see their particular financial statement. And they would explain their variances in those static Excel files, so we couldn't report off of them. Because now when a leader puts in their explanation, we can actually report off of those. So what we set up is a report. This says we are writing, so we have written now, a report that can aggregate up all of those variance explanations that were required. And we're sending those required variance explanations and those that haven't completed them yet to the network CFOs on a weekly basis so that they can try to hold our leaders accountable and ensure that the tool is being used as intended. So that is something more that we added onto this process. Yes. So with that implementation that we did for the first quarter here in June, we did upload those results into our financial planning module, and it was the baseline for the long range plan moving forward. And that was the first time that we used it, obviously, because we just had implemented it, and it went surprisingly smoothly. I know that sounds awful to say, but it went very smoothly. We didn't have any hiccups. It was almost as if we still had the budget process in place that we had used for years. Yeah, it's much easier for us to maintain this process than it was to maintain the budget process that would take us about 3 months, start to finish. So this is a lot simpler to use, and our experience with having one quarter already completed and starting the new quarter here with October completed, you can tell that the forecast results are much more aligned with the actuals that are coming through, as opposed to having those budget variances that we would likely have, not just because of COVID, but just because of having growth rates that aren't really happening, or having initiatives that aren't really activated yet, and just the timing of those things not align with the budget. So the forecast tool is working with getting more aligned with the actual, so that way we can use it as a tool to predict where we're going to be by the end of the year. So far, so good. The reason why I say so far, so good is because those targets are being set by our stewardship committee on a quarterly basis based off of the most current results. So we're not getting targets that may not be reasonable. They're more aligned with how we're performing. Mm-hmm. And the idea, though, is for next fiscal year, so when we're updating in January, we'll start layering on initiatives that are currently underway. So those targets for next year will be adjusted for those initiatives. So it's going to start looking more like a budget, because it's going to have those growth initiatives and cost reduction initiatives that are currently not forecasting out because we're trying to keep it at run rate. So yeah, I think as this evolves, it's gonna, that it might change. Not yet, because we are using that 3-month moving average as a benchmark. If they continue to deteriorate, they'll be identified. And with implementing comparative analytics, we're going to highlight those that have opportunities and set those targets in the future once we get to the new normal of having those benchmarks be our target. So that's something that we're driving towards. So we're not there yet, but yeah, eventually we will identify those underperforming areas and then hold them accountable to comparative analytics type of benchmarks, or just continuous improvement over their current performance.